Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this national Zoom meeting organised by the Australian Anti-AUKUS Coalition. I am Bevan Ramsden and a member of the Australian Anti-AUKUS Coalition Committee, which we call the Interim Working Group. Firstly, I want to acknowledge that I am speaking on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, land that has never been ceded. And I have profound respect for the history, culture, wisdom and land husbandry of the Gadigal people and pay my respects to their elders and leaders past and present. Tonight's meeting is taking place against the backdrop of heightened concern, if not outrage, at the direction Australia's leaders are taking us in foreign policy and military acquisitions. The extraordinary response to this Zoom meeting with over 500 registrations is testimony to that. The organisers, the Australian Anti-AUKUS Coalition, was formed following the announcement now 18 months ago by Scott Morrison of Australia joining the US and UK in a new security pact called AUKUS, with the Australian acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines, part of its first activity, and with its focus being on China containment using military means. A large number of community organisations and individuals, including peace groups, trade unionists, environmentalists, faith organisations, and anti-nuclear groups, met on Zoom and determined to join together in this coalition to oppose this authoritarian decision, which could propel Australia into another war, one which would have devastating consequences for Australians and the people of our region, if not the entire world. Tonight, we will hear from three eminently qualified people, their take on the government's foreign policy direction as indicated by the report on AUKUS and the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines, and the anticipated reports on war powers reform and the Strategic Defence Review. This will be followed by your questions and your suggestions on where we go from here in the peace movement. It is my hope that tonight will trigger a breakout of activity across Australia, with individuals and groups seizing the initiative and organising events and activities in their neighbourhoods, suburbs, towns, cities and workplaces. Now it's my pleasure to introduce your facilitator for tonight's Zoom meeting. Kellie Tranter is a lawyer and human rights activist and has recently chaired the People's Inquiry, organised by the Independent and Peaceful Australia's Network, IPAN, into the costs and consequences of Australia's involvement in US wars, the Alliance and alternatives. Ladies and gentlemen, Kellie Tranter.
Thank you, Bevan. I too wish to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land, in my case, the Wonnarua people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. I also wish to acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people who have marched with and campaigned alongside peace activists for many decades. I hope an Indigenous voiced parliament will result in Aboriginal people determining the fate of military installations and objectives on their sacred land and seas, because no one possesses the cultural and spiritual connection they have to country, and it must be preserved. Hello, everyone. My name is Kellie Tranter, lawyer and human rights activist, and I will be facilitating the discussion this evening in relation to the implications of the government reports on AUKUS, nuclear submarines, war powers reform, and the Defence Strategic Review. Before our speakers begin, I would ask that, as a matter of courtesy, viewers mute their microphones. I think they already are, but just remain muted and leave any questions until the end. I really would like all speakers to have the opportunity to share their knowledge and perspectives uninterrupted, so that we may in turn engage in informed debates and educate others. I understand that both the speakers and viewers are busy, so I plan to run to time and conclude this webinar at 8 p.m. If you're tweeting this event live, please use #StopPathToWar. All advancements of importance are initially made by a small group and gradually spread, usually from the ground up. At a time when tensions are high and headlines fire up bellicose politicians and pundits, it is comforting to be surrounded by people of grace and good sense determined to lead the world away from war. You're not alone in your concerns about the current trajectory, and the numbers reflect that, but we aren't starting from scratch, so we must continue to build on the hard work of others. My thanks to the organisers and to the Australian Anti-AUKUS Coalition. It is a great pleasure to introduce Brian Toohey. Brian was a columnist with the Australian Financial Review and has also written for the Nikkei Asia Review, the Western Australian, the Sunday Age and other publications. He was editor of the National Times and a Canberra and Washington correspondent for AFR. He is the author or co-author of 5 books: Secret, The Making of Australia's Security State; Oyster, The Story of the Australian Security Intelligence Service; Tumbling Dice, The Story of Modern Economic Policy; The Book of Leaks, and The Winchester Scandal. Among other subjects, he has written extensively about national security policy since 1973. Brian currently writes for the Saturday paper and Pearls and Irritations. The American public intellectual, Noam Chomsky, and you may not know this, Brian, describes him as, quote, Australia's leading military correspondent, highly knowledgeable, close quote. That's a very impressive accolade. Brian will speak on the implications of the report on AUKUS and the nuclear submarines. Brian, over to you.
Thanks very much. Nearly everything this government says about nukes is ludicrous and highly deleterious. I'll give some brief examples. Despite the Defence Minister, Richard Marles, saying that Australia will not participate in a war over Taiwan, Hugh White, a former Deputy Secretary of Defence, says the US would never sell nuclear submarines to Australia in these circumstances. They won't sell these nukes because they need them. They're in their line of battle. So without guarantees that we will always use them in a US war, they won't sell them. We need to get clear out of this, that Australian sovereignty does not exist. Miles now says the subs are not for war, but to protect Australian merchant shipping. 26,000 cargo ship movements to and from Australia occur each year. Nuclear submarines have terrible maintenance problems, and if we buy the expected 3 from America before 2040, only 1 is likely to be operationally available at any one time, and probably none. 1 or none can't protect 26,000 cargo ship movements, but the mainstream journalists swallow all of this nonsense. Just before his sudden conversion to pacifism, Miles wanted to deploy the nukes, or nuclear subs, I probably should say, off the Chinese coast so they could fire long-range cruise missiles into the mainland. This represented a return to the forward defence doctrine that failed in Singapore in 1942, and later in Vietnam. Caldwell, the Labor leader at that stage, delivered a magnificent anti-war speech in Parliament in 1965. He was fully vindicated in what he said. Now, Albanese, the Labor leader, effectively supports war. With Labor returning to the disastrous forward defence doctrine, it's worth remembering that the Coalition Defence Minister in 1969, Alan Fairhall, dropped forward defence and cut military spending by 5%, while there were still 7,000 Australian troops in Vietnam. The coalition then focused on defending Australia. Whitlam, Malcolm Fraser, Hawke and Keating all embraced the Defence of Australia doctrine. Howard, of course, scrapped it to go and fight in the Middle East. Australia's best defence is that it's surrounded by water and a long way from China or India, not that there's any evidence that either poses a threat to Australia. If this changes for the worst, the Defence of Australia doctrine will come into its own. Miles and Albanese are foolish to position nuclear submarines near China's coastline. That would play to China's strengths. It's where its forces are concentrated. And Albanese and Miles would be then responsible for a disastrous military blunder. It's much better to buy a small number of small submarines which are superior to nuclear submarines and let them defend the approaches to Australia. That would be playing to our strengths. Miles estimates that nuclear subs will cost up to $368 billion. Realistically, that means over $400 billion. As explained later, that includes the crazy decision to pay the UK to co-design 8 new submarines for Australia. This figure, $400 billion, dwarfs the next highest defence acquisition, which is $17 billion for F-35 fighter jets. It is just out of any other acquisition comparison with any other acquisition that we have ever made, and it's not necessary. The US Government Accountability Office and the Congressional Research Service have an outstanding record for exposing appalling waste and incompetence in US submarine shipyards. One Virginia sub, which is the type we're supposed to be getting from America, was tied up to a jetty for 5 years before it could be fixed. The US has a military budget at present of $880 billion, yet Albanese is giving it $3 billion to help improve the shipyards. Miles did not commission a cost-effective study of the options before splurging this $400 billion. But Australia could get 10 superior conventional submarines for 10 to 15 billion. That's for the lot from Japan, South Korea, or Germany that could deter any hostile ships approaching Australia from a couple of 1,000 kilometres out. Submerged drones could also help at a low cost. Japan's new subs use highly advanced batteries that run silently for several weeks without needing to surface to charge the batteries. Journalists are accused Keating of not understanding anything about this. It was they who didn't understand it. That is on the Keating's appearance on television. South Korean and German submarines are about to get much improved batteries as well. These new subs can run silently on hydrogen fuel cells as well as batteries. Nuclear submarines are much easier to detect. Incidentally, they also have to come to the surface to stick up periscopes and other equipment. You never hear that in the all the wonderful things they're supposed to be able to do. They produce an easily detected infrared signal due to the reactor constantly boiling water or steam engines that propel the subs. Yes, nuclear power does not propel the submarine, despite what everyone's saying that it does. Puffing Billy does that. When they go at high speed, they make a detectable wake on the surface. This government, largely unrecognisable for its labour values, is wasting $400 billion on dud submarines when so many pressing issues need to be addressed, including global warming, social welfare, health, education, affordable housing, and so on. Another huge problem with nuclear subs is that the government has rightly said that it will take all the highly enriched weapons-grade uranium waste, at the end of the sub's life and safely store it. This requires the waste to be vitrified overseas and returned in thick drums for burying deep in stable, dry underground rock formations for hundreds of years and heavily guarded over that time. Each reactor weighs about 100 tonnes and contains 200 kilograms of highly radioactive uranium. While uranium in nuclear power stations is enriched to about 5%, the same applies to French and Chinese nuclear submarines. It's 20% for Russian submarines. In our case, it's 93%, that greatly exacerbates the disposal problem. I recently asked Australia's principal nuclear safety organisation, the Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety Agency, what was required to safely dispose of this highly enriched uranium. To my surprise, they refused to answer. I can only assume they're intimidated by defence because they normally answer questions for public airing or for other organisations. that need them. Miles but however, although they're saying they're going to do the right thing, Miles exacerbated the problem by saying that the waste uranium would be stored on defence land. It can't be stored safely on the top of the land. It has to be stored deep underground. He's not dealing with low-grade nuclear waste. Neither the US nor the UK has a high-level underground nuclear waste repository. They could easily pressure Australia into securing their waste from their nuclear submarine reactors here. It seems likely that the burial site will be on land in central Australia, important to Australia's Indigenous population. Whatever happens, it is essential there is no repeat of what happened to the Aboriginal population of that area back while the British nuclear tests were underway in the 50s and 60s. Back then, the Indigenous population was willfully exposed to radiation during the British test, which occurred between the 1950s and 60s in the Australia's south and central desert. Apart from the fallout from atmospheric tests, plutonium was spread by other trials on the surface and blown on the wind at Maralinga. The secret goal was to develop triggers for British nuclear bombs, hydrogen bombs, I should say. Plutonium is highly toxic. It has a half-life of 24,000 years. It and other radiation was a particular danger to Aboriginals wandering around. 2 native patrol officers complained that they were given the impossible task of ensuring that Aboriginal people were kept out of danger over vast areas. The head of the British weapons research establishment responded that these officers displayed this in quotes, a lamentable lack of balance, apparently placing the affairs of a handful of natives above those of the British Commonwealth of Nations. Now, the secret AUKUS Pact, remember, there's no text of this thing. We don't know what has ever been released, unlike the other treaties that were in, such as the ANZUS Treaty. Now, this pact gives the UK another chance to display its values regarding Australia and nuclear issues. It doesn't meet its own nuclear standards. HMS Dreadnought, a nuclear submarine, began service in 1960 and retired in 2020. Instead of the submarine being dismantled, as was supposed to be the case, it remains in a dock over 40 years later. Fortunately, its nuclear fuel has been removed, but this is not the case in 9 other submarines, nuclear submarines, that have retired. These are stored on water at Plymouth, where numerous accidents have occurred involving submarines still in service. Many journalists put great faith in the intelligence briefings they receive from right-wing ideologues and others about the alleged threat from China. They claim Keating can't say anything of value because he hasn't received an intelligence briefing in decades. On the contrary, this is a distinct advantage. Nothing worse than having an intelligence briefing if you want to understand something. Keating's detractors should pay a lot more attention to the role intelligence played in the illegal invasion of Iraq. The recent 20th anniversary of the invasion, led by George Bush, Tony Blair, and John Howard, reminded us that this act of aggression was solely claimed that at the time of the invasion, his government knew, and that was his word, Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction. He knew no such thing. Thanks largely to the much disparaged weapons inspectors, Iraq did not have any, yet Howard falsely claimed that they were capable of causing destruction on a mammoth scale. Many Australian journalists now rely on purported intelligence and propaganda for their flimsy claims about Chinese acts of aggression, which barely rank alongside the death and destruction wrought by the US, aided by Australia over many decades. Now, Chinese journalists also rely on excessively rely on government sources. The White House engaged in a blatant act of propaganda when unveiling the plan for Australia to get nuclear submarines. It claimed, quotes, "For over 60 years, the UK and the US have operated more than 500 naval nuclear reactors without incident or adverse effect on human health or the quality of the environment." Unfortunately, that was a lie. In fact, 2 nuclear submarines, the Thresher and the Scorpion, sunk during that period with the loss of all lives. Mainstream Australian journalists have not bothered to examine this staggering falsehood. Key White House staff must have known it was a lie. What Albanese got from Andrew Shearer, a key advisor to him, is publicly unknown. He should have known, but whether he did, I don't know. By the time Australia's new nuclear submarines arrived, the first of them arrived and peace broken out. Meanwhile, advances in sensor technology and computing power will probably make nuclear submarines relatively easy to detect and destroy. Bang goes 400 billion. That's it, thanks.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that informative address, and I look forward to the opportunity to ask you some questions towards the end, and hopefully we're going to see your face on the Insiders panel in the not too distant future.
Well, that's 30 years ago.
Oh dear. Our next speaker this evening is Dr. Alison Broinowski, President of the Australian for War Powers Reform, formerly an Australian diplomat. Alison is the author or editor of 14 books about Australia's dealings with the world and Asian countries in particular. Her PhD is in Asian Studies from ANU. She has researched and taught there and at Macquarie University and the University of Wollongong. Alison will speak on the implications of the inquiry into war powers reform, and her comments are very timely, as I understand the parliamentary report is due any day. Alison was the panel leader on foreign policy for the IPAN Peoples Inquiry into the cost and consequences of Australia's involvement in US wars and the alliance, and she really is a force of nature. Alison, over to you. Have we got you there, Alison? Oop, we've got Alison muted. We just need to unmute Alison.
Okay, is that all right?
We've got you.
Good. I want to say that you're a force of nature too, if I am. And I also want to thank everybody associated with IPAN and the Anti-AUKUS efforts over all these years. Annette, Bevan, Ross, Shirley, Jonathan, everyone, and their fantastic work and how they get it all together as they have done this evening. Now, 20 years ago this month, as we all know, on the instructions of Prime Minister Howard, Australia invaded Iraq. The reasons he gave to us were false, and he was never held to account for that. Howard had already invoked the ANZUS Treaty to commit Australia to the war, quote, on terror, anywhere in the world, starting with Afghanistan. That war has still not ended, nor has the devastation and suffering that both the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq caused. Our protests against them were ignored. Yet, here we are, 20 years on, and we have Americans like John Bolton, Sean Hannity, and Nikki Haley, who are now talking up a new axis of evil. This time, instead of being Iraq, Iran, and North Korea, it's Russia, Iran, and China. This is happening right now, and people are swallowing it. And yet, again, the reasons for it, as before, are false. The new, quote, Axis nations may be seen by the US as challenging its global supremacy, but none of those three countries, Russia, Iran, or China, poses any threat to Australia. Once again, however, Australians are being told to get ready to fight, this time against China. The list of reasons we've been given changes by the day. We have to fight, they say, because China's responsible for the pandemic. It's taken over Hong Kong. It's threatening to take over Taiwan, its own territory. It's committing genocide against Uyghurs. It's playing wolf warrior games. It's using Huawei and TikTok and the United Front Work Department to spy on us. Oh. We're told by 9 News to be on red alert. We're told that we have to protect our shipping routes for exports to China, the very same routes that China uses for exports to us. We're told by our leaders that we have to defend Australia's sovereignty, which we've already surrendered to the US anyway. We don't ask, and they don't tell us, if the US will place nuclear weapons in Australia. We don't know if they will launch them for Australia or what will happen if there's a nuclear accident here. We aren't told the true cost of AUKUS, probably because the government doesn't know it either. Certainly, it will be an enormous amount that will leave us unable, as Brian said, to defend our continent or provide adequate social services and infrastructure for future generations of Australians. AUKUS will condemn our grandchildren to paying off a huge national debt for weapons with which Australia can aggravate, threaten, and spy on China. To pay for it, we may be forced to store the world's nuclear waste. We can't even store our own. Does the US expect Australians to fall for these same axis of evil tricks again? Labor in opposition saw through them in 2003, as Brian referred to. It's much worse now. Can an ALP government now ignore our protests? It can't. Not when a former Prime Minister, 2 former foreign ministers, and current and former politicians speak out in growing numbers against AUKUS. People listen and respond as they did to IPAN's cost of war inquiry. When 94 out of 113 submissions to the current parliamentary inquiry into war powers support reform, and 87% of people surveyed do too, those voices can't be ignored. Something has to change. The inquiry into how Australia makes decisions into send service personnel into armed conflict may achieve that change. But if it recommends a compromise, perhaps by codifying the convention that a prime minister can make a captain's pick for war, even for an illegal invasion, then that will not represent reform. If the reasons for that war are not spelled out, there will be no reform. If there is no independent report on how Australia enters that war and its results, there will be no reform. Governments in Australia can and will get away with resisting the people's desire for change in our foreign and defence policies for as long as the executive holds the prerogative, the ancient royal prerogative for war. They can and they will go on claiming that reform risks Australians' prosperity, sovereignty, and security. And many may believe them, forgetting that the government has already traded them off for AUKUS. Independents were elected in May 2022 when they accorded when they called, many of them, for accountability and transparency from government. Only by putting a motion for war to both houses for a debate and a vote can that be achieved in practice. Not just the Prime Minister, but all of our elected representatives should be responsible for the consequences of the next war. For as long as our leaders secretly sign Australia up for weapons agreements, foreign bases, and future wars, revealing no details to us until it's too late, they cannot expect our trust or acquiescence to what they're doing. They will be accused of doing the bidding of our American ally and ignoring the Australian people. They will be playing us for suckers, as they did in Vietnam, Afghanistan, and Iraq. We haven't forgotten the disastrous results of those wars. Our government is being warned by us at this meeting and others all over the country in growing numbers. Don't play us for suckers again. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, and thank you for your strong leadership and advocacy on these issues over a very long period of time, and for your appearance at Parliament for War Powers Reform, where you were so impressive with the case that you made on behalf of so many of us. And I sincerely thank you for all that you do. And on that note, I'll move over to Dr. Vince Scappatura, who teaches politics and international relations at Macquarie University. Monash University Publishing recently published his book, The US Lobby and Australian Defence Policy. Vince was the panel leader on defence for the IPAN Peoples Inquiry into the costs and consequence of Australia's involvement in the US wars and the alliance, which is a report you can all obtain on the IPAN website. Vince will speak on the implications of the Strategic Defence Review report, which I believe is due to be released next month. Vince, over to you.
Thank you very much, Kelly, and thank you very much to the previous speakers for those very informative and enlightening comments. And also thank you, I'd like to extend my thanks also to the organisers of tonight's very important and urgent event. So as Kelly mentioned, the brief that I've been given is to talk about my thoughts on the implications of the Defence Strategic Review. Now, I can only speculate about this, of course, because the review hasn't been released yet. It's not expected until early next month, as Kelly mentioned. However, I don't think it's too difficult to discern what the basic framework of the review is going to be, because it's not really intended to be a genuine independent review that will offer fearless and frank advice to the government based on sound evidence. Rather, the review was commissioned, in my opinion, to provide a rationalisation for a defence policy that has more or less already been decided. The independent leads charged with undertaking the review are established insiders, not known for challenging government orthodoxies, and they won't give much time to undertake a comprehensive review anyway. None of the submissions were made public. There were consultations, but with a narrow band of mainly foreign defence contractors, internal security agencies, and think tanks closely aligned with government thinking, like the Australian Strategic Policy Institute and the US Studies Centre. In other words, the review was set up to ensure an outcome that would adhere to a set of narrow parameters that were preordained. So what were those parameters? Well, Defence Minister Richard Marles made those parameters clear, I think, in a couple of key addresses in November last year. The first was to the Submarine Institute, and the second was to the Sydney Institute. And Marles has since repeated these basic parameters, or these basic strategic assumptions that I think will underpin the Defence Strategic Review many times, elsewhere since then. And I think they've been echoed too in the remarks by both Brian and Alison. Essentially, according to Marles, the narrative is that because of deteriorating regional strategic circumstances, which basically means the rise of China, the security which our geographical isolation has afforded us up until now can no longer be assumed. For the first time since the Second World War, or at least in the 1970s when the so-called Defence of Australia doctrine emerged, we now face the prospect of a direct threat to Australia within a 10-year timeline, and which requires a significant military build-up to confront. Now, it's important to dwell on that point for a moment, because although I believe it's a misleading narrative and a misleading assessment, it actually reveals an important truth. The alliance has never fundamentally been about defending Australia against a high-level direct military attack, because we've never really faced one. In fact, there's a very good case to make that the threats that we have faced as a nuclear target during the Cold War and at present, terrorism after 9/11, and today with the threat of war with China, only existed or were exacerbated at the very least because of our alliance with the United States. This was true when we went to war with the US in Vietnam. It was true when we went to war with the US in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And it's true today as we prepare to go to war with the US against China. We are, and always have, supported the US through the alliance not to guarantee our defense, but to protect American military and economic dominance, irrespective of the cost to our security or the security and independence of others. Former Prime Minister Paul Keating was not wrong when he made that point in his recent address to the National Press Club. Our political elites have been satisfied to voluntarily subordinate our country to the American empire, to shine the master's boots, so to speak, in order to realize the benefits and privileges, as they see it, of very exclusive membership into the club of US-led Anglosphere nations. Richard Marles wants us to believe that our strategic circumstances have deteriorated so precipitously that we suddenly need to undertake an urgent and very expensive military build-up in order to protect us from a potential Chinese military threat. Except that what he is proposing for that military build-up doesn't make any sense even by his own logic. Because what is being proposed isn't a defence strategy to defend the Australian continent and our immediate air and maritime approaches. That was the old Defence of Australia paradigm. Instead, Marles is suggesting that this military build-up support a new defence strategy that he has dubbed impactful projection. An impactful projection is about the ability to strike an adversary, namely China, much further out from the Australian continent. The heart of impactful projection, says Marles, will be our forthcoming nuclear-powered submarines, which will be able to reach all the way to the Chinese coastline, as Brian mentioned in his remarks. But apart from nuclear-powered submarines, impactful projection is also about a massive investment in long-range strike capabilities more generally, so long-range missiles, eventually hypersonics, drones, and so on. The focus of this military build-up is going to be in Australia's north, with further upgrades to basing infrastructure, missile stockpiling, fuel reserves, and so forth. And because long-range strike is more about the Air Force and the Navy, there is widespread speculation that the Defence Strategic Review will be deprioritising spending on the Army, particularly for things like armoured vehicles, which are obviously used primarily in land wars. In other words, the military build-up being proposed belies the rhetoric about China's great military build-up reaching out to threaten Australia, because we are gearing up to project our military power to fight closer to China and in the South China Sea. Now, I should say that impactful projection is not really an innovation of Richard Marles. The awkward phrase is, but the focus on long-range strike was in fact something that was first earmarked in the 2020 Defence Strategic Update under the Morrison government, excluding the AUKUS nuclear-powered submarines, of course. What's new is that the Labor government is determined to bring the initial timelines for that military build as far forward as possible, and that's going to be very costly. It's also true that while there's a lot about impactful projection that is evocative, it also shares similarities with prior defence strategies, particularly the so-called forward defence strategy of the 1950s and 1960s that landed Australia in disastrous counterinsurgency wars in Southeast Asia. Back then, a Soviet-Chinese expansionist threat was concocted in the form of the fallacious domino theory, so that the US, with the help of European colonial powers and Australia, could crush the decolonization and independent nationalist movements that were spread throughout the global south at the time. There was no threat of a Soviet or Chinese invasion or high-level conventional attack on Australia then, and the same is true today. The only reason that China might launch missile attacks, not an invasion, against Australia would be the context of a US-China war, probably over Taiwan, in which Australian leaders give the go-ahead for the north of this continent to be used as a major base of operations for American power projection capabilities against China. The US Marines, US bombers, and US nuclear submarines that will now be host forward American operating bases. In that scenario, the ADF wouldn't be engaged in defensive war per se, but rather would be engaged to defend the north of this continent as a sanctuary for US power projection forces, along with some of our own, engaged in a far-off war with China, 100 miles off its coast and in the South China Sea. Now, it's a mistake, I think, to assume that Australian leaders don't understand this, that they are so blinded by subservience to their US masters that they fail to assess the threat environment accurately. Prime Minister Albanese, just in November last year, speaking with reference to the Defence Strategic Review, rhetorically quipped that Australia is obviously not going to be involved in a land war in central Queensland, even though the China threat scare campaign in the media in recent years conjures up that image. His point, and that of Miles, is that because we live in a globalized world, and because we are so dependent on global trade and communications as an island nation, that China could inflict enormous damage on us without ever having to enter our territorial waters or airspace by threatening these critical supply chains. Except, as Alison also mentioned in her remarks, the major supply chains that China might theoretically threaten mainly run to and from China. So why on earth would China want to blockade itself from us? China has not and is not threatening freedom of commercial navigation in the South China Sea. What it is doing is pushing back against scores of US military exercises, literally hundreds of provocative intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance missions that the US undertakes every year in China's air and maritime approaches, often launched from US military bases that surround China. And even if it were true that Australia's sea lanes of communication were at risk, isn't it even more true for China, which is in fact more dependent on seaborne trade than we are? Hasn't China lived for decades under the shadow of US hegemony and the ever-present threat of the US Navy dominating its seaborne trade routes? And doesn't that fact, at least partially, explain China's desire to challenge US military dominance, not far away from its shores where we claim to face a threat, but right up in its periphery? Doesn't China have legitimate security interests that we are threatening by participating in what the US calls integrated deterrence? How can we expect China to address legitimate concerns that we have about their growing military power, including bullying behavior in the South China Sea, including human rights concerns, economic coercion, etc., if we insist that the only solution is for China to live under the shadow and threat of US military and economic dominance? In short, the implications of the Defence Strategic Review, with its new focus on impactful projection, are patently obvious. It's provocative. It's going to tie Australia further to American war plans for maintaining its dominance in Asia. It's going to decrease our direct security, threaten regional and global security, risk a nuclear war that could possibly be terminal for organized human life, and diminish our sovereignty. And just on that last point, those commentators who argue that concerns about sovereignty are misplaced because we tied ourselves to the US a long time ago don't make any sense at all, at least to me. If you've dug yourself a hole, the first thing you need to do is stop digging. The impactful projection, the expansion of the US force posture initiatives, and AUKUS are all making it much harder to climb out of the hole we've dug ourselves. So let me just finish on one final, more positive note. Although our sovereignty is being voluntarily diminished by all of these decisions by our political leaders, it's not extinguished by any means. It's no accident, I think, that we hear pundits in the media reiterate ad nauseum, like those in the recent Red Alert scare piece in 9 newspapers, that we have no choice when it comes to joining the US in a war with China over Taiwan. It's obvious why this is constantly repeated, because national security elites know very well that the Australian public is rightly reluctant to support such a war. And so Australia's participation is being carefully framed as inevitable to preempt public opposition. Yes, there is an elite bipartisan consensus on Australia joining a US war with China, but that does not mean we, the public, have to acquiesce. Constantly asserting that there is no choice is an effort to convince people that resistance is futile. But it's not. If it were, there would be no need to psychologically prepare the Australian population for this new war footing, which is exactly what has been going on over the past 5 years or so, with the consciously designed propaganda campaign, which we now know was initiated by Australia's intelligence and security agencies to sell the China threat narrative. We don't have to buy it, we shouldn't buy it, and we should not accept that our future participation in a war with China is a fait accompli. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vince. And this is Vince's book, The US Lobby and Australian Defence Policy. I highly recommend it. I have it on my desk on a permanent basis. So thank you, Vince. We now move on to question time. And I remind people to please remain muted unless you are the person asking the question. Please keep your questions brief so we can respond to as many questions as time permits. You can also make comments, questions or suggestions in the chat or by email to AAAC-IWG@googlegroups.com, and those details are in the chat, to be considered by the committee at a later stage. You'll find, like I said, that email in the chat box. One of the perks of being the facilitator is I can throw a few questions first while we're waiting for some questions to come in, which I shall do. And if I may, Brian, I'll direct those to you. The first question, actually I have 3 questions. I apologise for that. But the first question I have is, are you able to provide an assessment of the reality of force projection or structure that China has? Because I think there's a lot of misinformation swirling around about that. The second question is what would it take to disentangle ourselves from the US war machine, given the comments in your book, Secret, the Making of Australia's Security State, and the depth with which we're sort of intertwined. And the third question relates to some comment made by the US National Security Advisor en route to San Diego, just prior to the AUKUS announcement. And he was asked, Jake Sullivan is his name, and he was asked, is there a gap in communications with China related to military affairs? And his response was, well, we don't have the kind of stable, steady, predictable, uninterrupted military-to-military communications channels that we think would be responsible and most effective for ensuring that there is no miscalculation, no accident, no mistake, no possibility for unintended escalation. We would like to see that. Would you care to just sort of decode, unpack what he's suggesting in that comment? Thank you, Brian.
Can I go with the first question first? Or is that okay?
Sure.
What China's got by way of defences developed is, first up, America's got 700 bases around the world, and China's got a tiny one somewhere else. And it's basically bottled up behind a whole lot of choke points underwater, so that the submarines can't get out without being detected and destroyed in a war. There's arrays of ballistic sonar arrays all the way down, and so that it's very, very bottled up. Nuclear submarines are no use. I hope they understand that. They're very noisy, and not much use. They don't have as many nuclear weapons as China, as the United States, or for that matter, Russia. And I think they realized that the ones that they were banking on, based on submarines, they're not really, they won't survive. They'll be sunk straight away by the Americans. So they put more missiles now on land, and which is not what America bothers to do anymore. But yes, they've got reasonable defence forces, but they don't spend anything like as much as the United States. The United States spends as much as the next to 9 countries together on military equipment and so forth. And also it's got bases all around China, all through the Pacific Island chains. They have basically turned some of those islands into colonies. And we hear all this talk about that China might have been getting, or trying to get, a naval base in the Solomons. I don't see why they would, because it's so far from China that it's very, very hard to supply it. What I've not seen in the mainstream Australian media is anything about all the bases that the United States has on the other Pacific Islands, and what they demand that the islanders must do for that. I mean, very early on, we should remember that they were hit with hydrogen bomb tests by both Britain and the United States. The first one basically completely evaporated the island. It just disappeared. But to sell it to they did move the islanders, but to sell it to them as to why they had to move, they said things like, "This will be for humanity," or "This will be for Christianity." And so that I think that, fortunately, I think that China will try very hard not to do anything to annoy Taiwan. And the Taiwanese realise, and this seems to be the opinion, that they've got de facto independence already. So why on earth would you rock the boat? Whereas there's immense pressure being put on by America for them to declare independence. And as long as China doesn't take the bait, I don't see why there's any excuse for a war over Taiwan, unless, and this is a serious danger, America manufactures one, which they've done in the past. Now I better get on with what else we were saying. What was the one about war making? Sorry.
It was just a question, Brian, about disentangling ourselves from US command and control. Given your comments in your book Secret about the extent to which we're sorry.
Yes, we can if we want to. And I don't mind the ANZUS Treaty because of the Article 1 says that you should never use force aggressively in international relations. That's also, of course, in the NATO thing, and America takes no notice of it, nor do we. But if we obeyed that, things would be a lot better. There's no need for AUKUS. It's just a throwback to the British colonial. What the British are doing in there, I have no idea. But we don't know what the thing's about. I can't believe that no one's demanded that we get the transcript of it. I mean, there's no doubt about what's in the ANZUS Treaty. It's all published from day one. So I think if what you want is independence, independent policies, and it's going to be one part of it's hard because I don't think Albanese understands any of this. He said, "Well, what's the problem? We've already buy planes and that from America, and we're sovereign because of that." Well, you're not really, because you can't get them fixed without the parts being sent back to America, and no Australian technicians are allowed to be there. So we can't. They know all the time what our weapons systems are doing because they have the electronic control systems in it. So if at the moment they're very keen that we put into the submarines their combat and control systems so they can know where we are. And they say that's needed for exercises. Well, Australia exercises with 12 other countries with submarines that don't have American combat and control systems. Oh, what was the last one? Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay, Brian. That was just in relation to the National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan's comments about not having that military to military and communications channel, which would avert things like mistakes, which we don't want to see in this region.
Well, his motives might be different, but yes, it's a good idea to have conversations and meetings and all of that. But everything that the America does these days is disingenuous. So, and I really think things will be worse under the next, if there's a Republican win, and someone like the former Secretary of State, who is just an extraordinary hawk, and that's Pompeo. He will be certainly willing to use nuclear weapons because he's one of these end of days Christians who believe that he will be going up to heaven on a cloud with angels around him when there's a big war in the Middle East and it's won by America, and so he's got nothing to lose.
Thank you, Brian. I can see some hands up, so we might move to. I can see John. You've had John and Mike, John Hallam and Mike Head. You've had your hands up for a while. So, John, would you care to ask your question if you unmute?
Yeah, sure. I guess the question was, and I mean, it's perhaps there's a degree of rhetoricalness in it, but still, is there not a disconnect between, on the one hand, we are being told, and I do in part believe, that there may be an immediate threat, that is to say, a threat in the next 12 months to years. And on the other hand, we are told to prepare for this by purchasing submarines that in all likelihood won't be available, if they're ever available, until 20 years down the track. And of course, I draw people's attention both to the memo that I sent yesterday and again today to Albanese and much of the rest of the Parliament. And I've been arguing similar things now, I realise, for about the last 12 months. We have technologies and we have systems that are capable of outperforming the Virginia-class submarine now. It's called the Collins-class sub. And yet we are going to replace a sub that can effectively run circles around the Virginia-class with the Virginia-class. It sort of doesn't make a heck of a lot of sense, not even military sense.
So, John, do you have a question for any of the panelists? Is there a specific question?
Well, is there any suggestions as to what might be a possible rationale behind that? Because the whole thing makes it at a technical and military level alone, it makes zero sense.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just mention?
I would like people to comment on it.
Thank you. Please mute again, just while the panelists respond to your question. Thank you.
Look, the Collins-class submarines are no good, and let's not pretend they are. They're really outdated. They don't have any of the ways that allow submarines to move very quietly, etc. But there are very, very good submarines, as I mentioned, from Japan, South Korea, and Germany, which are much better than nuclear submarines. The Collins-class are not.
Thank you, Brian. Mike, I'll throw to you. If you could keep your question brief, if possible, so I can try and move through as many of these hands as possible. So over to you.
Thanks, Kellie. Yeah, Mike Eddie. I'm a member of the Socialist Equality Party and a correspondent for the World Socialist website. We've just been campaigning in the New South Wales election, making the issue of war very central. The war underway in Europe by the US and its allies against Russia, and the increasing provocations by the US against China, which are designed to goad China into a similar conflict over Taiwan. And we have found deep opposition in working class areas to the danger of war. Now, but what I want to raise, what I object to in this meeting and the whole orientation of the Anti-AUKUS coalition is that you are seeking to divert that anger and opposition in a nationalist direction. You know, that it's all about we, Australia. We are not for the defence of Australian capitalism. We are for the unity of the international working class against all the governments that are responsible for war. To stand on the back of Australian imperialism, which has always rested on the hegemon of the day, first the UK, then the US, is a reactionary position. It ends up defending the interests of Australian capitalism and its own imperial interests, particularly in the South Pacific, which that's why they've chosen the American alliance after World War II. The second point I just want to ask people to respond to is, how can you fight war when you're aligning yourself with war criminals, such as Paul Keating, who was a member of the Hawke government when they launched the first invasion of Iraq alongside the United States. Bob Carr, who was a member of the Labor government that beefed up the surge in Afghanistan, and in which war crimes were conducted in Afghanistan. And last weekend we saw, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who helped write the speech of Colin Powell at the United Nations, the lies of weapons of mass destruction. I just think this is a very, reactionary nationalist direction to take. We have to turn to the working class globally in a fight against capitalism. That's the only way to stop war. And I'd like some responses to that, please.
Okay, Mike, would you mind just muting before we move on to our panelists for a response to your comments? Alison, did you want to contribute to that, or would you like to respond?
Yeah, I've heard from Mike and his colleagues before about this, and I understand the passion with which they hold their view about the working class worldwide, and in particular, the declining fortunes of working people everywhere in the world are absolutely lamentable, while the military-industrial strategic invigilation complex, whatever you want to call it, profits enormously from these wars. And that, I have to say, is the global perspective that I take upon it, not so much from my organization's point of view. We are just concentrated on what the Australian polity should be doing about war. But I completely understand where he's coming from about that. And in particular, the way international organizations like the UN have been disparaged for years by the Americans and their friends, simply because they don't support the idea of US hegemony everywhere, and because they uphold things like the International Criminal Court and the objectives 15 years and 15 years for global development, all of which are directed at towards the world's poorest and most disadvantaged people. And I completely agree with him about the appointment, the importance of that. I don't go into personal diatribes against Australian politicians who have belonged to one party or another and who have done whatever they did. And some are now being held accountable for it and others are not. And that is the kind of thing that I think we need to do more work in. So thank you.
Thank you, Alison. I have one question here from Alan Griffiths. What about Pine Gap's capability in jamming overseas countries' early warning radar systems? The Soviet Union was aware of Pine Gap. How likely is it that it could be a target? Vince, or would you like to respond to that? We still got Vince. Brian, would you care to?
Vince to answer it, I should say.
Sorry, I was trying to speak. I couldn't unmute myself.
Sure.
But I've been given permission now. The short answer is yes. I mean, undoubtedly, Pine Gap was and is still a high priority nuclear target. There's, I'm sure, an ICBM in Russia that's pointed in Pine Gap and quite possibly in China as well. And as I mentioned in my remarks, when I was making the case that the Australia-US alliance has decreased our security, this is one very profound way. I mean, the only really scenario that we can imagine a nuclear attack on Australia would be as a result of a nuclear exchange between the US and Russia, or the US and China, in a great power conflict, where Pine Gap as an integral part of that nuclear warfighting capability would also be targeted. In fact, I think even outside of nuclear war planning, Pine Gap has become incredibly important in US military war plans more generally. I mean, the importance of Pine Gap in providing targeting information for the US military is absolutely crucial. It would absolutely be critical to any US war effort in East Asia. And even if Australia was not to provide any kinetic contribution to a war with China as part of its alliance with the United States, we would still be automatically involved as a result of the critical role that Pine Gap would play. So yes, I think it should also be at the heart of our efforts to disentangle ourselves from the Australia-US alliance.
Thank you, Vince. I've got another question from the chat, Bob Phelps. Could the new rules that allow Australian farmers to repair US farm machinery, replacing the maker's monopoly, be a model for Australia repairing the subs and other equipment? And a little notation, not sure who would answer this. So not sure, Brian, if you wanted to have a go at that, or Vince?
Well, probably Vince as well. Look, the submarines are so complex. The nuclear submarines are so complex. I cannot believe that they will be able to be built here and repaired here. It's just, I don't think they'll understand what they'd be getting into. Whereas Adelaide could build conventionally powered submarines quite sensibly. Vince, sorry, should say something.
Vince, would you like to add anything to those comments? No, we might have a mute.
Sorry, it just takes a moment, I think, for the host to unmute me. Look, no, I don't have any particular expertise on that point, so I don't think I have anything worthwhile to contribute. But I did want to go back to something that Mike said earlier. Actually, if you don't mind me just making a comment about that, because I think it was important. And that is that we talk a lot about the strategic competition between the US and China, but there is a really important economic dimension. And I think that's really important for the peace movement to consider. In fact, I think probably there are economic routes that are the kind of primary driver between the declining relationship between the US and China, which we should not forget, not that long ago, were actually cooperating with one another, okay, particularly on economic issues. And so I think there is a kind of degree of intercapitalist competition, which is fueling the US-China rivalry. I consider China to be more engaged in economic capitalist growth. So I think there is a kind of inter-capitalist competition going on. And until that's addressed, even if the geostrategic elements were resolved, we would still get the potential for conflict. And so I think acknowledging that economic dimension translates into an agenda, not just to oppose militarization of the region, to oppose foreign military bases, oppose foreign military alliances and all that's very important. But we also need to think about advocating for a kind of new, regional economic framework that supports, equitable kind of growth and sustainable growth and development, and not just, for China, but, for the global South more generally. It's no secret, of course, that global trade and investment rules, favor rich countries in the West and major international corporations to the detriment of working people in the environment. And, China has challenged some of these rules in ways that, I think are actually quite helpful, providing much needed investment in the global South to fuel, growth and to challenge kind of the neoliberal model and conditions that have been imposed by Western financial institutions like the IMF. On the other hand, I think there are also serious problems with, China's own kind of debt-driven investment model of economic growth, and it's had harmful impacts inside of China. It's attempting to, export that model with detrimental consequences on parts of the global South as well. So I think, the region, the world desperately needs an international framework that not just fosters peace and security. Of course, that's important, but we also need to think about the economic aspects as well. I think they go hand in hand, and the peace movement really does need to, or really can't address one without addressing the other.
Thank you, Vince. I think we might take 3 more questions. I'm just mindful of the time, and then just move to some final tangible takeaways from our panelists in terms of the way forward and significant steps and actions we can all take in relation to AUKUS and other matters. So I'll say, I can see, David, you had your hand up. If we could keep our questions very directed and brief so that we can get through the 3 final questions, that would be fantastic. David, you've got the floor.
Right, thank you. I'm just hoping that Alison can help me on this. As I understand it, when Australia recognised China, it recognised Taiwan as being part of China. It appears we're planning for a war against our major trading partner, against a government that we recognise, against an organisation with a government we don't recognise. Can somebody help me on that?
Thank you, David.
I wish I could, David. Quite frankly, I think the government has dug itself into a hole there, and as has been recommended earlier, they should dig themselves out of it rapidly, as should the United States, which has exactly the same agreements and entered into them at exactly the same time as we did, and for all the same reasons. That Taiwan has historically, well, at least since about the 14th century, been part of China. And the argument, and give or take Japan's occupation and so on, the fact is that we recognize it. And the absurdity is that we go off our tree when some country in our region decides to switch their recognition from Taiwan to China, which is exactly what we do. I mean, the absurdity of this is never explained to us, and we should expect more honesty from our ministers about such questions. Why is it okay for us to recognize that Taiwan is part of China, but it's not okay for the Solomon Islands? Why is it okay for China to say they would resist firmly any attempt to separate Taiwan from China when we don't propose any such thing ourselves? What in the world are we on about? I mean, I don't get it. And I suspect that, as somebody said earlier, I suspect that Albo doesn't get it either. And this is not a good position for Australia to be in, because for 20 years, we've been taking our foreign and defense policies from the United States. We haven't been doing any homework. We've got lazy and slack, and we need to work out, as Vince said, an independent position of our own, tell it to the United States, tell them that we're not interested in forming any kind of coalition to attack Taiwan, and let them get on with it if they want to. Not our business. And I promise you that if we did that, It would not damage our relationships with the United States at all. What we do about submarines is a whole nother matter. And in fact, coming back to that, if I may briefly for one moment, Hugh White says we'll never get them anyway. No way is it going to work. The sooner we get out of the agreement and save the money, the better.
Thank you, Alison. 2 more questions before I throw to Shirley. Jasper, I can see your hand up there. Would you care to unmute and just keep your question brief for the panelists? Thank you.
Brilliant. Hi all. Fascinating discussion. Look, I've just got a question. I think we have had a lot of discussion tonight about the fact or the idea that Australia doesn't have an independent foreign policy. I know this is a question that's been raised before around the idea that, you know, we have always been at the will, beck and call of the US. And I guess my question is, I think it's a difficult question to actually wrap one's head around when it comes to the fact that historically, yes, we have been involved in, you know, wars that the US has directly started, but we've also had expeditions of our own. We've also had, you know, conflicts where we have been in opposition to the US, not in, you know, combat to combat opposition, but things in Indonesia where we were on opposite sides of the Indonesian independence question before the interest that Australia had as a capitalist nation and a nation that has interest in these countries that the US also has in different ways, flipped us around on that. And my question is, if we actually have an independent, you know, foreign policy or defense strategy, as whatever we want to kind of characterize that as, when our economic system is so heavily tied into the US-led system that is not only the US, but is also its kind of constellation of nations that has been built up through the very violently imposed US economic order that we can point to through Latin American, Southeast Asian, African and Middle Eastern history over the last 60 to 80 years. What does it actually look like that even if we have our own military, we don't have American bases on our continent, when our kind of economic framework is built around continuing trade and protection from the US in its economic sense, do we actually think, I would actually really love to know what the panelists think would translate into independent Australian economic policy, if that is the case, because to me that doesn't really connect if we've also got the economic interests that align us with what the US currently has, at least from the part of the Australian, you know, ruling and the kind of economic class that gets to make those decisions, which is why we have to have meetings like this instead of being able to decide that we don't want war on a grassroots level. I guess that would be my question.
Thank you for your question, Jasper. I'll just get you to mute while Vince, would you like to tackle, that's a pretty large question that needs to be unpacked. Would you like to have a go at that? I know you're waiting to be unmuted, Vince, so I won't give up on you.
Okay, can you hear me?
Can.
Great, thank you. That's really a terrific question, and I think you brought up a really important conundrum, and it was what I was alluding to before about the economic dimensions and the military geostrategic dimensions of the US-China conflict. I mean, that same kind of dimension exists with our relationship with the United States. It's not just about military integration; it's about economic integration as well. And of course, you know, US global capitalism has very large tentacles all over the world, and you know, much of the world is integrated into the US global capitalist system, and Australia, you know, is no exception to that. And to a certain extent, even if Australia were to eject the United States, you know, bases in Australia, even if we were to, you know, revoke the ANZUS Treaty and declare ourselves as independent, we would come up against hard limits. And those hard limits are that we wouldn't be able to, on our own, extricate ourselves from US global capitalism, which is why that, you know, movements need to be international and not just individual and isolationist. And I guess it goes back to the question before about, you know, nationalism. That doesn't mean that, you know, nationalism and the attempt to kind of extricate ourselves as far as we can go within the kind of global capitalist system that we live in is not a admirable and worthy goal to achieve. I mean, there were plenty of countries integrated into the US capitalist system that didn't join the US in going to war with Iraq or Afghanistan. Then there are plenty of countries that are not going to join the US in going to war with China potentially over Taiwan, even though they are also equally integrated into the US global capitalist system as much as we are. So there are plenty of things that we can achieve and that we should try and achieve within the system that we're in. But yes, I agree, we'll eventually hit limits. and we'll have to try and find ways to transcend those limits when we get to them. And it's going to be an internationalist movement and not just a nationalist one.
Thank you, Vince. I've got one final question that came through the chat from David Palmer. Is the AUKUS nuclear propulsion a prelude to a nuclear hosting arrangement like Germany, Italy, Belgium and Netherlands, like they have with the US? Brian, would you like to respond to that or have a comment?
That would be basing American nuclear missiles here, or possibly on the B-52 bombers. They have got no particular reason to do it. When they attack China, they will attack them very seriously from big nuclear submarines. But they don't put ICBMs on any other country, in any other country except the United States. Maybe they would want to put some semi. The trouble is the ranges will have to be fairly long. In Europe, those nuclear weapons were mid-range really, whereas here, if they're going to hit China from here, it's still a long way, and I don't think they'd want to do it. But I might be wrong about that. But I mean, one of the things they can do with the B-52 bombers is put very long-range standoff missiles on them. I don't think they'll be dropping old-fashioned bombs from there.
And Brian, what do you make of the inconsistency with the neither confirming or denying the existence of nuclear capability of US capabilities rotating through versus full knowledge and concurrence? What do you make of that?
I'm astonished that they just don't say that we will not let the United States bring nuclear weapons onto Australia. What's wrong with saying that? And I don't think they'd do it if you didn't want that, although they would get very, very angry. But this other stuff is just ridiculous. New Zealand, by the way, is still sticking very, very strongly to its views in this area. And it's the same with the South Pacific nuclear-free zone. It was wrecked by Bob Hawke, who insisted you make a carve-out to let American nuclear submarines go through. And I don't think, I think you could try and change that treaty if you wanted to. But I don't see much motive for them to put nuclear armed missiles in Australia. I may be wrong.
Thank you.
They want to put plenty of other things here, so including new space warfare things from operated from Pine Gap, in violation, of course, of the treaty we've entered into, that no weapons can be used, should be used in space.
Thank you, Brian. I think if we could just have one final remark from each of the panelists before we get the final thanks from Shirley. Just one takeaway message for all of us from each panelist tonight. You've all been fantastic, but some advice, some tangibles, so some tips on how to perhaps push back on the current trajectory that we're on. Alison, did you want to start that off?
Thank you, Kellie. Yes, I'd like to acknowledge the numbers of people who have said in the chat that they would like to see Australia with a much more independent foreign and defence policy, with which I totally agree. And I don't see any reason why that should be at odds with any of the treaties that we have signed, several of which have been mentioned tonight. And as long as we go on behaving as we do, not only doing everything the United States wants, but volunteering to do more, going and saying, hey, can we also do this? Which is what AUKUS represents. And more and more. There is a saying in the United States that the Australians will agree to anything. That is not the kind of reputation that we, as a decent, independent middle power, should have. What we should be doing is concentrating on our region, not defending ourselves against it, but working together with it and saying, this is where we live for the rest of time. We are not interested in introducing foreign hostilities into where we live or into the countries of our neighbours. That's it from me.
Thank you, Alison. Vince, your final remarks.
Thank you. Thanks, Kellie. Yes, I've also been trying to follow along on the chat, and I think there are lots of really useful suggestions and comments in there. I noticed many were talking about the opportunity to exploit the fracture that appears to be happening in parts of the Labor Party over AUKUS. I think that's definitely a strategy worth pursuing. Unfortunately, on an issue like this, AUKUS or the Alliance more generally, public opinion's not really going to matter much. Even if we get, education and awareness raising is really important, of course, but even were a majority of the Australian public to oppose particular aspects of the US alliance, and already we know that a majority, are opposed from the latest polls I've seen are concerned about AUKUS. Because there are powerful vested interests involved, it's not going to change anything. If there's a strong bipartisan consensus, they'll just ride out the popular opposition as long as possible until it maybe fizzles away or is distracted by something else, and then they'll just continue on. So I think it is really important to try and create that split in the elite consensus. And there is a glimmer of hope from what we've seen with regards to notable former, Labor and current officials who have publicly and vocally spoken out about AUKUS. I mean, Brian has got a much longer kind of memory than me about this. Maybe he'd like to comment, but in my lifetime, I can't remember kind of an issue on the US alliance where there has been this much kind of outspoken criticism. And I wouldn't say it's promising, but it's an opportunity, I think, that we could exploit.
I think the problem started with Labor signing up to the AUKUS stuff in the first place. They've turned themselves into an incredibly small target. If a normal Labor Party would have said, no, we will not be buying nuclear submarines, that's it. And you would not have lost election saying, oh, we don't want to spend $400 billion on this sort of stuff. I think it's good to see the former Labor ministers coming out and speaking out, but it's going to be terribly hard to break the bipartisan support at the political level for this. But it's certainly worth trying. And the other thing I'd like to see Australia do is put a lot more effort into trying to have arms control agreements and support throughout Asia, and not just doing it on our own, but getting a new organisation together to promote arms control and try to avert war.
Thank you very much, Brian, and thank you to all the panellists for their insight. I'd like to see the points raised in this particular webinar circulated on the socials, as they say, so we can repeat the message, the repetition of the ideas, which helps with the public discourse. And on that note, thank you, Brian, thank you, Vince, thank you, Alison. It's been a privilege. I'd like to thank the organisers, Bevan, IPAN, all of the members of the Anti-AUKUS coalition, and I'll throw it over to you, Shirley, for the final wrap up.
Great. Thank you, Kellie. So firstly, thank you, Kellie, for smoothly facilitating a large Zoom meeting. There were over 200, and making sure that as many as possible would have an opportunity to ask questions and make proposals for building a broad public campaign. And that's what the Anti-AUKUS Coalition is. The Australian Anti-AUKUS Coalition was set up to develop a broad-based campaign, uniting people, unifying the movement against AUKUS and against war. So also thank you, Brian, Alison and Vince. for sharing with us your knowledge and insightful analysis as usual. They're important tools for empowering and giving confidence to the people in exposing the lies, the fear and the misinformation. And we've had plenty of that in the last month or so. And also in showing the truth about the AUKUS war lines and the aggressive and dangerous nuclear submarines that potentially could lead to war, a nuclear war, in fact. So building a well-informed and a broad people's movement that calls for peace, to stop AUKUS and nuclear submarines, and that will unify working people. And I think that's one of the key things, objectives of organisations like the campaigns, like the Anti-AUKUS Coalition and IPAN, which could send a strong message to all politicians, even as far back as the USA. And at the present time, it's the empowerment of the people that is absolutely critical. And that's what we're trying to do in Anti-AUKUS campaign. And finally, thank you to all the participants for joining and contributing to a very informative Zoom meeting. Thank you for your contributions and the lively discussion. And your proposals are important, and they will be considered as we prepare for the next stage of broadening and strengthening the campaign for peace and exposing the truth about AUKUS and nuclear submarines. So now is the time to get out in our communities, in our workplaces, raise AUKUS and nuclear submarines with friends and families, challenge the lies, and organise and raise awareness. There is, I think most of us experienced in the last 2 weeks, a real backlash, public backlash, and it's a wide backlash to the announcement of Australia purchasing nuclear submarines, spending $386 billion, diverting funds away from the needs of ordinary people and the environment. So we urge people to organise your local peace group in your neighbourhood, in schools, workplaces, raise it in your unions and pass resolutions. Pass resolutions in your unions, pass resolution in your community organisation. And the Australian Anti-AUKUS Coalition and many peace organisations will assist and support you. So thank you again for coming, and thank you for giving your considered views and your suggestions for building a movement. And we'll see you soon, we hope. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.